Rudolf Hess spent 40 years in crushing isolation, earning the title the loneliest man in the world. Albert Speer smuggled out 20,000 secret pages, while Baldur von Schirach went blind behind bars. These shocking stories show just how harsh and sometimes bizarre the reality of Nazi imprisonment really was. Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess's imprisonment stands as perhaps the most extreme example of prolonged isolation in modern penal history. Hitler's former deputy was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials for crimes against peace and conspiracy, beginning what would become a 40-year journey through the depths of solitary confinement that transformed him into what guards would call the loneliest man in the world. Transferred to Spandau prison in West Berlin on July 18, 1947, Hess began his sentence alongside 6 other Nazi war criminals, but over time he became the last remaining inmate of Spandau. By 1966, he was the sole occupant of a prison built for 600, watched over by an entire staff. The upkeep cost West Germany hundreds of thousands annually just to house one man. Hess's imprisonment was controlled by the four-power administration of Spandau, with the US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union rotating authority each month. This rotation caused dramatic inconsistencies in his treatment, mirroring Cold War tensions. Under Soviet control, he endured extreme deprivation: no books, no visitors, no communication, conditions modern experts deem psychological torture. Western rotations brought relative relief, but even then, the conditions were deliberately austere. Hess was known only as Prisoner Number 7, forbidden from speaking to guards unless absolutely necessary. His daily routine was rigidly structured, awakening at 6 a.m., performing calisthenics in his cell, being escorted to the lavatory at precisely 7 a.m., eating breakfast alone, then walking in the prison garden, 215 paces back and forth with his hands clasped behind his back, never deviating from this mechanical pattern. The isolation took a severe psychological toll, leading Hess into paranoia and delusions. Guards reported him accusing others of poisoning his food, erupting in rage, and even goose-stepping through the corridors. His fixation on conspiracies and persecution was seen as a direct product of his profound loneliness. Lights were flashed into his cell every 15 minutes throughout the night as a suicide prevention measure, making restful sleep impossible for decades. Hess's family contact was tightly controlled, with visits limited to 30 minutes a month behind a partition, even after seeing his wife and son again in 1969, following nearly 3 decades apart. Photos of grandchildren he never met offered rare comfort amid his isolation. Despite calls from leaders like Thatcher and Brandt for humanitarian release, the Soviets blocked every proposal, insisting his freedom would dishonor their war dead and risk fueling neo-Nazi movements. The mystery surrounding Hess's death on August 17, 1987, adds another layer to his already extraordinary story. Found hanged with an electrical cord in the prison's summer house at age 93, authorities ruled it suicide, though his family and some observers suspected foul play. The prison was demolished within weeks of his death, its rubble dumped in the North Sea to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. From isolation to obsession, we shift to a prisoner who survived by building a world of his own. Albert Speer. Albert Speer's 20-year imprisonment at Spandau prison presents a stark contrast to the isolation experienced by Rudolf Hess, though it was marked by its own unique challenges and psychological adaptations. Hitler's former architect and armaments minister was sentenced to 20 years for war crimes and crimes against humanity, a sentence he would serve in its entirety, making him one of the few high-ranking Nazis to complete his full term without early release. Speer's daily routine began at 6 a.m. with rigid precision that reflected the military-style administration of Spandau. Each day, Speer cleaned his cell and corridors before retreating to the prison garden, which became his lifeline and creative outlet through detailed landscape designs. His cell itself was stark and oppressive, small, dimly lit, with bare walls and meager bedding. In winter, the lack of heating left inmates shivering, conditions even Chancellor Adenauer condemned as inhumane. What made Speer's experience unique among the Spandau prisoners was his approach to intellectual survival and his systematic documentation of prison life. Despite strict prohibitions against writing diaries or memoirs, Speer secretly wrote extensive accounts on toilet paper and smuggled them out through sympathetic Dutch orderlies and guards. These writings, totaling approximately 20,000 pages, would later form the basis of his best-selling books, Spandau: The Secret. Diaries, and Inside the Third Reich. Speer turned the Spandau Garden into both a masterpiece and a coping mechanism, redesigning the grounds into winding paths, rock gardens, and floral displays despite periodic Soviet bans on flowers. His daily life swung between harsh deprivation under Soviet control and relative leniency during Western months, creating a constant psychological strain. While disliked by fellow prisoners for admitting guilt at Nuremberg, Speer endured through reading thousands of books and his famed walks around the world, pacing the garden until he had symbolically circled the globe. Medical care at Spandau was adequate but basic, with rotating physicians from each of the four powers providing regular health monitoring. Speer maintained his physical health through garden work and his mental exercises, though he occasionally attempted to use health concerns to gain early release, efforts that failed due to Soviet opposition. Speer was released in October 1966 with Baldur von Schirach after serving his full 20-year sentence, stepping into a world that had long left him behind. His release drew intense media attention, fueling fascination with his supposed redemption. As Speer walked out to cameras, another inmate was fading into darkness, Baldur von Schirach. The imprisonment of Baldur von Schirach, the former leader of the Hitler Youth and later Gauleiter of Vienna, presents a story of gradual physical and psychological deterioration within the walls of Spandau prison. Convicted of crimes against humanity for his role in deporting approximately 65,000 Jews from Vienna to concentration camps, Schirach received a 20-year sentence that he would serve in its entirety alongside Albert Speer. As prisoner number 1, Schirach endured the same strict regime as the others, but his story was marked by declining health and the friendships that helped him endure. Unlike inmates released for medical reasons, his imprisonment dragged on as he slipped into near blindness and increasing frailty. His life followed the rigid routine of Spandau: cleaning, gardening, meals, and lights out, broken only by monotonous tasks like envelope making on rainy days. By the late 1950s, Schirach was nearly blind, losing one eye's vision and struggling with the other, which limited his ability to read or join activities. His health declined further with a blood clot in 1963 and a failed retinal surgery in 1965 that left him almost fully dependent on others. Unlike fellow inmates released early on medical grounds, he was denied clemency and spent his final years in Spandau as a nearly blind prisoner. Schirach's declining health was worsened by personal loss when his wife divorced him in 1950, severing ties to their 4 children and leaving him without family support. The alternating leniency and harshness of the four-power system added further strain, especially during Soviet rotations. Even so, he preserved friendships in prison, particularly with Funk, and avoided the conflicts and isolation that plagued other inmates. When Schirach was finally released alongside Albert Speer at midnight on September 30th, 1966, crowds had gathered outside the prison demanding freedom for the remaining prisoner, Rudolf Hess. Schirach and Speer emerged wearing the same clothes they had worn at the time of their 1945 arrests, as per protocol, marking the end of their 2-decade journey through the international prison system. Now to a Navy man who refused to bend Erich Raeder. The story of Erich Raeder's imprisonment reveals how health concerns and Cold War politics could intersect to produce early releases that might not have occurred in times of greater international stability. The former Grand Admiral of the German Navy was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against peace and war crimes, but his actual time served would be significantly shortened by a combination of deteriorating health and strategic diplomatic considerations. Captured by the Soviets in May 1945, Raeder was at first treated with surprising leniency, enjoying comfort, good food, and even opportunities to advise on naval matters before his indictment at Nuremberg. Sentenced to life imprisonment, a punishment he considered worse than execution, he arrived at Spandau in 1947 as prisoner number 4. There, he established order by serving as chief librarian with Dönitz as his assistant, complete with symbolic insignia that preserved a sense of naval hierarchy behind bars. Raeder and Dönitz, despite their naval ties, clashed constantly over wartime strategies, with Raeder defending battleships and Dönitz championing U-boats, their disputes at times turning physical. Raeder lived by the strict Spandau routine, rising early, cleaning and tending beans in his garden with naval-like precision. Like all inmates, he endured the alternating harshness and leniency of the four-power rotations, especially under Soviet control. The most significant aspect of Rader's imprisonment was his steadfast refusal to acknowledge guilt or express remorse for his actions. He engaged in debates with the French prison chaplain, Georges Cassalis, who urged him to confess guilt for spiritual salvation, but Rader consistently refused, insisting on his innocence and portraying the German Navy as having fought a clean war without complicity in Nazi atrocities. He viewed the Nuremberg verdict as a political show trial designed to deflect blame from the Allies and the Treaty of Versailles. On September 26, 1955, the four powers agreed to Rader's release at 11:35 a.m. after he had served approximately 9 years of his life sentence. He left the prison in a private car with his wife and flew to Hanover, where he required hospitalization for several weeks to recover from his ordeal. He became the second Spandau inmate to be released early for health reasons, following Konstantin von Neurath. From ironclad conviction to failing health, we turn to Walter Funk. Walter Funk's imprisonment at Spandau Prison presents one of the clearest examples of how severe health issues could both define a prisoner's experience and ultimately lead to compassionate release. The former Reich Minister of Economics and President of the Reichsbank was sentenced to life imprisonment for his extensive role in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. But his actual time served would be cut short by a cascade of medical problems that made his continued imprisonment increasingly untenable. Funk arrived at Spandau in July 1947, where his imprisonment, like all else in the prison, was shaped by the rotating control of the four Allied powers. Though his days were structured by the same rigid schedule as the others, frequent illness often disrupted his routine, making him one of the most medically difficult inmates. When healthy, he immersed himself in gardening, especially tomatoes, and joined in prisoner discussions, though even casual talk could earn official warnings. Funk's relationships with fellow prisoners were generally amicable, particularly his inseparable friendship with Baldur von Schirach. This bond provided crucial emotional support as Funk's health declined, with Schirach often fetching meals during Funk's frequent illnesses and providing companionship during his bedridden periods. Funk maintained resilience despite confinement, participating in group discussions and contributing to the lighter moments that occasionally broke through the oppressive atmosphere of the prison. However, it was Funk's deteriorating health that would ultimately define his imprisonment experience. By early 1947, even before his transfer to Spandau, he was requiring hospital visits. In 1948, he developed a serious bladder condition that required regular medical attention, complicated by diabetes, creating a complex medical situation that the prison's facilities were initially ill-equipped to handle. Funk's declining health forced administrators to build a surgical ward inside Spandau, both to handle his needs and to avoid risky hospital transfers. Suffering from bladder issues, diabetes, and frequent weight loss, he often stayed bedridden on special diets, receiving inconsistent care under the rotating Allied system. His crisis peaked in 1956 when, under heavy guard, he underwent gallstone surgery in Berlin, a successful operation that prolonged his life but left him frail. Medical evaluations confirmed Funk's deteriorating condition, leading to his compassionate release on May 16, 1957, after serving approximately 10 years of his life sentence. He became one of 3 lifers released early for health reasons, joining Konstantin von Neurath and Erich Raeder in this category. Before departing Spandau, Funk made personal visits to his remaining fellow prisoners, Albert Speer, Rudolf Hess, and Baldur von Schirach, saying goodbye to the men who had shared his decade of confinement. Then came the U-boat commander, who never apologized, Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz's imprisonment presents a unique case study in how a war criminal could maintain dignity, military bearing, and complete lack of remorse while serving what many considered an unjustly lenient sentence. The former Grand Admiral and Hitler's brief successor as head of state received only a 10-year sentence for crimes against peace and war crimes, the lightest penalty among major Nuremberg defendants, a verdict that sparked controversy and protest from over 100 senior Allied officers who viewed his U-boat tactics as equivalent to Allied submarine warfare. Dönitz spent 10 years in Spandau, steadfastly loyal to Hitler and determined to protect his reputation, often clashing bitterly with fellow Admiral Raeder. Serving as Raeder's assistant librarian, he upheld military-style order, even as their feuds over naval strategy sometimes turned physical. While devoted to gardening and routine, he secretly smuggled communications to preserve his legacy, enduring the sharp contrast between harsh Soviet months and more lenient Western rotations. Dönitz served his sentence at Spandau prison from October 1946 until his release on October 1, 1956, maintaining throughout his imprisonment the same uncompromising loyalty to Hitler and rejection of guilt that had characterized his defense at Nuremberg. His decade in prison would be marked by his systematic efforts to preserve his reputation, his tempestuous relationship with fellow Admiral Erich Raeder, and his complete refusal to acknowledge any moral responsibility for Nazi crimes. Dönitz's time at Spandau swung between strict deprivation under Soviet control and relative leniency during Western months, shaping a constant psychological strain. His feuds with Raeder over naval strategy often turned into heated outbursts, while his hostility toward Speer, whom he blamed for his Nuremberg fate, deepened over the years. Unlike Speer, Dönitz never wavered in his defiance, clinging to Nazi loyalty and rejecting any admission of guilt. Medical care at Spandau was provided by army officers from the four Allied powers, with regular health monitoring and adequate treatment when needed. In 1948, Dönitz was reported to have high blood pressure, along with a pre-existing chronic prostate disorder that had been noted during his trial. However, unlike several of his fellow prisoners who were released early due to health concerns, Dönitz served his complete 10-year sentence without major medical crises requiring intervention. When Dönitz was released on October 1, 1956, after serving his complete 10-year sentence, he emerged unrepentant and focused on defending his legacy. From defiance to frailty, we move to the oldest prisoner, Konstantin von Neurath. Konstantin von Neurath's imprisonment tells the story of how age, health, and diplomatic status could intersect to produce one of the earliest releases from Spandau prison. The former German diplomat and foreign minister was convicted of conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and initiating wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, receiving a 15-year sentence that would be cut short by a combination of failing health and Cold War political considerations. At 74 years old when he arrived at Spandau, von Neurath was the eldest prisoner and quickly showed signs of the decline that would ultimately secure his early release. Designated as prisoner number 3, his scheduled release date was September 30, 1961, but he would serve only about 7 years and 4 months before being freed on November 6, 1954, primarily due to severe health deterioration, including a heart attack and progressive near-blindness. Von Neurath, the oldest prisoner at Spandau, found the rigid daily routine increasingly unbearable as age and poor eyesight weakened him. He often needed help navigating the prison, a stark contrast to his once powerful position. Despite this, his diplomatic temperament earned him goodwill among inmates. Garden work offered some engagement, but also highlighted his growing dependency. After a heart attack in 1954, fears of his death in custody prompted the Allies to grant him early release. Lobbying for von Neurath's release came from conservative German political circles who portrayed him as a traditional diplomat caught up in Nazi crimes rather than an active participant. This campaign, combined with genuine medical concerns about his survival, created pressure for humanitarian clemency that the Western powers found increasingly difficult to resist as Cold War alliances became more important than prolonged punishment. Von Neurath's early release on November 6, 1954, was controversial and tied directly to Cold War politics. The Western powers agreed to his release to foster goodwill with West Germany amid rearmament efforts and NATO integration, while the Soviets reluctantly acquiesced but opposed broader clemency measures. His release was part of a pattern that would see other elderly or sick prisoners freed early, reflecting pragmatic political considerations rather than pure humanitarian concerns. Public demonstrations outside Spandau demanded freedom for remaining prisoners like Rudolf Hess, with von Neurath's release serving as a precedent that fueled campaigns for additional clemencies. After his release, von Neurath lived quietly at his estate in Württemberg until his death on August 14, 1956, at age 83, just 2 years after his release. But outside Spandau, a different system produced a different story, Alfried Krupp. The story of Alfried Krupp's imprisonment represents perhaps the most controversial example of lenient treatment for Nazi war criminals, revealing how economic considerations and Cold War politics could dramatically influence the justice process. The head of the Krupp industrial empire was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment and complete forfeiture of property for war crimes, including the exploitation of slave labor. but his actual experience at Landsberg prison would be characterized by comfort, privilege, and an early release that outraged Holocaust survivors and Allied prosecutors. Krupp was transferred to Landsberg prison in early August 1948, shortly after his conviction in the Krupp trial. Landsberg, located in Bavaria and officially designated as War Criminal Prison Landsberg Prison, had a notorious past, once holding Hitler under privileged conditions while he wrote Mein Kampf, and later housing political prisoners, many of whom died from mistreatment. After 1945, it became the main US-run prison for Nazi war criminals, where over 1,600 were confined and 252 executed by hanging. Life there was divided sharply between those awaiting execution and those serving sentences. High-profile industrialists like Krupp benefited from US penal standards that stressed rehabilitation, granting them better conditions and opportunities for sentence reductions. This more lenient approach reflected a focus on treating them as ordinary criminals rather than solely as war criminals. The daily routine at Landsberg was structured, but surprisingly comfortable for prisoners like Krupp. He shared accommodation with Hans Heinrich Lammers, a former Nazi Reich minister and co-defendant, in the main war criminal wing. Inmates wore standard US-issue red and white striped prison uniforms, but their daily lives involved structured work shifts of light duties rather than hard labor, in accordance with Krupp's specific sentence terms. Krupp's time at Landsberg was described as one long sunlit holiday, marked by plentiful food, access to books, writing materials, and even his own supply of Camel cigarettes. Rather than punishment, it became a period of reflection and networking, where he discussed post-war industry and retained influence. Guards maintained a lenient, professional relationship, creating conditions that contrasted sharply with the executions carried out elsewhere in the prison. Krupp's early release came as part of a broader clemency review by US High Commissioner John J. McCloy, who pardoned 32 Landsberg inmates on February 3, 1951. This decision was influenced by German lobbying, economic reconstruction needs, and anti-communist priorities that made figures like Krupp valuable for rebuilding West Germany's industrial capacity. The clemency came after Krupp had served only approximately 2.5 years of his 12-year sentence. Krupp's release was met with cheers in Essen, where many Germans saw him as a victim of Victor's justice, and by 1953 his property was restored, enabling him to rebuild his industrial empire. Critics like prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz condemned this leniency as crimes without punishment, given Krupp's use of over 100,000 enslaved laborers. Afterward, Krupp supported fellow ex-inmates through the Landsberg-Hilfe network, treating imprisonment as a shared hardship rather than accountability for atrocities. Krupp's privileged confinement wasn't unique. Another Landsberg inmate shows the quieter version of the same arc, Erhard Milch. Erhard Milch's imprisonment represents one of the more obscure stories among Nazi war criminals, partly because he left no detailed personal accounts of his experience, and partly because his case became overshadowed by more dramatic stories from facilities like Spandau. The German Generalfeldmarschall and key Luftwaffe figure was convicted in the Milch trial for war crimes involving forced labor and crimes against humanity related to enslavement and deportation, receiving an initial life sentence that would be commuted and result in his release after approximately 7 years. Milch began his sentence at Rebdorf prison near Munich before being transferred to Landsberg prison in Bavaria, where he would serve the majority of his term alongside other high-profile Nazi war criminals. His experience provides insight into how the US military prison system handled Nazi defendants outside of the more famous Spandau facility, revealing a different approach to war criminal imprisonment that emphasized American penal standards over the international political considerations that governed Spandau. Milch's imprisonment at Landsberg shows how the US system handled Nazi war criminals differently from Spandau, prioritizing American penal standards over Cold War politics. His life sentence was reduced to 15 years in 1951 by John J. McCloy, reflecting shifting US priorities as West Germany became an ally against the Soviet Union. Daily life at Landsberg was structured but humane, with access to workshops, a library, chapel services, and medical care, all framed as part of rehabilitation and denazification. Unlike Spandau's four-power system, US oversight ensured stable conditions, though public opinion and Cold War dynamics increasingly fueled clemency campaigns. Milch even challenged his detention in a US Supreme Court habeas corpus petition, which was denied in a split decision, showing that prisoners retained limited legal recourse. Sharing confinement with figures like Sepp Dietrich and Alfried Krupp, Milch lived in a larger, more diverse prison community that allowed broader interactions than the small, tension-filled circle at Spandau. Milch was paroled and released in June 1954 after serving approximately 7 years of his commuted sentence. Milch was released as part of the broader wave of clemencies that reflected shifting US priorities and growing reconciliation with West Germany. Afterward, he lived quietly in Dusseldorf as an industrial advisor, publishing memoirs that emphasized his career rather than his imprisonment. He died in 1972 at age 79, his low-profile post-war life contrasting with the more dramatic trajectories of other former war criminals. From commutation and parole, we end with a 2-act imprisonment across 2 systems. Josef Sepp, Dietrich. Josef Sepp. Dietrich's story presents the unique case of a Nazi war criminal who faced imprisonment twice, first under US military authority and later under West German jurisdiction, revealing how different legal systems and political contexts could produce vastly different approaches to war crimes prosecution. The high-ranking SS officer and commander of the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler was implicated in multiple war crimes, most notably the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, leading to sentences that would span more than a decade, but under surprisingly lenient conditions. Dietrich's first trial took place at the US military tribunal at Dachau in 1946, where he was convicted alongside 72 other Waffen-SS defendants for issuing orders that encouraged the mistreatment and execution of American prisoners of war. Initially sentenced to life imprisonment, his term was commuted to 25 years in 1948, following testimonies from other German officers who attested to his character and argued for his limited direct involvement in the massacre itself. Dietrich was transferred to Landsberg Prison, designated as U.S. War Criminal Prison No. 1, where he would experience what official reports described as ideal prison conditions that met the highest standards of prison administration. The system at Landsberg was modeled on the German concept of Festungshaft, fortress confinement, which emphasized rehabilitation over punishment through better living conditions, visits, and access to learning. Prisoners like Dietrich followed a structured routine but enjoyed privileges such as adequate food, barber services, exercise, and reading time. The prison's cross-shaped layout allowed both isolation and supervised group interaction, creating a balance between control and limited social life. Cold War politics soon shaped his fate, as German protests and media campaigns pressured for clemency, while the US saw benefit in easing tensions to strengthen West Germany. Regular medical care, sentence reductions for good behavior, and credit for pretrial detention all reinforced Landsberg's more humane, reform-focused approach compared to harsher wartime prisons. Dietrich was paroled on October 22, 1955, after serving approximately 10 years, as part of the broader clemency movement that saw 91 war criminals released early by 1951. His release drew protests from American veterans, but was beyond US control following the restoration of German sovereignty under the 1955 treaties that ended the occupation period. However, Dietrich's freedom was short-lived. In August 1956, he was rearrested by West German authorities and tried in Munich for his role in the 1934 Night of the Long Knives, where he had provided a firing squad that executed 6 SA leaders on Hitler's direct orders. This second trial, conducted under German law rather than international military jurisdiction, resulted in his conviction as an accessory to manslaughter and an 18-month sentence. Dietrich returned to Landsberg prison on August 7, 1958, now under Bavarian Ministry of Justice control rather than American military administration. The facility had maintained its progressive standards with continued emphasis on vocational training and rehabilitative programs, though the atmosphere had changed with the transition to German control and the departure of most American personnel. By his second imprisonment, Dietrich was 66 and plagued by heart and circulation problems that required frequent medical care. Unlike the Americans, Bavarian authorities were more willing to grant clemency on health grounds, reflecting the difficulty of holding frail, elderly prisoners long-term. He was released in 1959 due to his deteriorating condition, but soon became active in HIAG, the Waffen-SS veterans group lobbying for the rehabilitation of SS members. Until his death from a heart attack in 1966, he remained loyal to SS ideology and unapologetic about his past. That brings us to the end of this video. For more interesting videos like this, click on the cards on your screen.